It's a brilliant, brilliant event, and you'll come away with lots of new ideas and a better understanding of this incredible exponential world. You get to speak to the smartest people like you trying to figure this out, but also the people on stage. They're the experts. So we get all of that, all in one place, in Singapore. What more can you ask? See you at TOKEN2049.
Welcome back to Real Vision. I'm Ash Bennington. Today we're joined by Shawn Hackett, president of Hackett Financial Advisors, talking about ag and weather cycles and its relationship to price action. Shawn, welcome back to Real Vision.
It's great to be here, Ash, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
Well, I'm very excited to have you. I have to say, I was looking at the slide deck this morning. Really cool charts, really interesting graphics. Set this up for folks who don't follow weather and ag. Give us the 50,000-foot overview about what we're going to talk about today.
Weather is cyclical. If you look past the last 1,000 years, you'll see repetitive cycle statistics and correlations that repeat. Let's put it this way. We call it rhyming. In fact, we have a slide here that says, that what has been will be again, meaning the history will repeat itself to a large degree. And so my job is to try to find those cycles, statistics, and correlations, lay them out, and give price forecasting recommendations to my producers and end users. What we have found is that what really impacts weather volatility and cycles is the activity of the sun, what's going on with the sea surface temperatures of our oceans, what's happening with large volcanic eruptions, and what's going on with localized deforestation. And all our work for going past 1,000 years, those have been the variables that have had the greatest impact on either reducing or increasing weather volatility. And of course, agricultural production and prices are greatly impacted by how weather plays out and what production potential is. Right now, all the above that I just mentioned are moving into a more volatile cycle for the first time in over 400 years. And what I hope to do today is kind of go over those situations and kind of talk about what's happening right now that's actually in front of us and what it might mean for the future of ag prices and production, for not only the next few years, but also the next decade.
So let me just belabor the obvious here for a second, Shawn. I know many of our Real Vision viewers have been watching you for many years on the show, but for people who are relatively new to the commodities space, talk about the obvious importance of weather in forecasting agricultural commodities prices.
Well, I mean, let's just take an example of a couple of years ago when Argentina had a 1 in 100-year drought. Their crop production fell in half, and so when you have a country like Argentina that's the fourth or fifth largest exporter of grain markets and ag markets in the world, it has a huge impact to the supply-demand equation and what prices need to go for in order to balance that out. On this show, in the past, I mentioned a few years ago that we had made a prediction for the first major coffee frost in 26 years that actually turned out to happen, and set the coffee market off into a significant supply-demand mismatch because of a very damaging, unique frost that hadn't happened for almost 3 decades. So these are the kind of things we look for in important areas that are exporters to try to determine, what's going to be the correct price level to match supply demand if those weather factors do in fact play out. No one can predict future weather perfectly, and we're not saying that anybody can, but what we're trying to do is lay out are the higher probabilistic weather shocks that are in front of us and act accordingly.
Very well said, Shawn. With that said, let's dive in and take a look at the deck.
So I really want to spend a lot of time on this particular slide because I think it's important. We all know we have high tide, we have low tide. Our oceans are impacted by the gravimetric forces in outer space. We know the moon is involved in that. The sun is involved in that, meaning those two bodies impacting or imposing their gravimetric forces on our oceans impact those oceans materially. We know that every planet has a different mass, spins at a different rate, rotates at a different rate, has a different magnetic field strength, has a different gravimetric strength, has a different torsional forcing strength. They're always in motion, which means climate is always changing. There is no such thing as steady climate. My job is to determine which way is it changing, how long is it going to change that direction, and when may it switch and reverse as it always has in the past. The point being that if we understand how all of these planets are impacting the sun and the moon and the earth, it can give us a lot of input and insight into solar activity, sea surface temperature trends, and how that overlays into what kind of weather we can expect in our upper airflow patterns here on Earth. This is they call this the orbital theory of climate change, and it's something that I'm going to refer to over and over again of how these cycles interact. So this is the big picture concept here that I'm going to be continuing to refer to, and hopefully it'll make a little more sense as we kind of move along.
Perfect.
So the first thing, the barycenter is the center of gravity of the solar system. It alters and changes as these planets are moving around and altering their positions. This is a measurement of exactly the motion of the sun. The sun rotates around the center of gravity of the solar system. There's times that it rotates fairly marginally, and there's times that it rotates wildly. We are here. We know exactly where the barycenter will be at every moment in time. 200 years from now, we know exactly where it's going to be based upon the exact positioning of the planets. What I want to emphasize is if you look at where we are today, we're going to be rotating the sun in this wild, erratic fashion going out into the 2040s, early 2050. This is a very erratic rotation around the barycenter from normalcy. When you get that, it does a couple of things. First, it alters how the sun's gravimetric forces impact the oceans, and it also reduces the solar wind strength coming from the sun. That's very important because we know the activity of the sun and how much of that solar wind is hitting our atmosphere has a lot to do with the upper airflow patterns that we're seeing. So this is something that is an exact science. This is not a hyperbole. This is not theory. We know exactly that this happens and that it has a huge impact. And we will be referring to this going forward.
So Shawn, when I look at this, and again, I'm a complete novice at this.
Sure.
But when I look at this, what I see is this: sort of we are here and here. That we're in a period right now and have been for the last 4 years, according to this data, where we see the Earth in a position that's rather out of cycle. It's rather I don't know what the right term is, but it's quite different from from the place that it traditionally is. What impact does that have on what we're seeing right now in terms of weather or weather patterns?
Well, the sun's rotation, if it's more erratic, like this is showing, because this dotted line is the sun, by the way. So we're showing about the sun's erratic movement around the barycenter. So I'm going to answer your question in just a second. This top chart here is the 11-year solar cycle. This is the number of sunspots that are going off at any moment in time. You can see that we go, and this is the number of sunspots here on the left scale here. So you can see that we go repeatedly from almost no sunspots to a peak, to a trough, to a peak, to a trough, to a peak. This has been going on ever since Earth and the sun have existed. It's called the 11-year solar cycle. I want to emphasize is that notice that there's been a general decline in these sunspots over time. And one of the reasons that happens is because of a more erratic rotation of the sun around the barycenter. The other reason that happens, Ash, is there's something what's called the solar dynamo. It's the physicist studies that show that the sun has 4 magnetic fields that spin around. Normally, they find themselves on one side of the sun or the other, which produces a strong magnetic field strength, which creates these peaks. And when they rotate to the other side, you get no sunspots and then these peaks again. Every about 200 to 220 years, though, you'll find that these magnetic field strengths, which are all moving at different rates, find themselves on the opposite side of the sun's hemispheres, canceling each other out. It's called destructive magnetic field theory. And when you see that, the magnetic field strength of the sun weakens, sunspots cannot form when the sun's magnetic field strength weakens. And hence we get a lower period of approximately 30 to 40 years of lower sunspot activity. We are in that cycle now. And one of the ways that we go about this, Ash, to make it a little more clear to those watching, this is the 24-month moving average of number of sunspots. It means we just take the last 24 months, we average them together, and it tells you what the average sunspots has been. You can see how we've been seeing the sunspot number falling and falling and falling. And based upon the cycles, we expect this number to continue to fall and trough sometime in the late 2030s. These two periods where you're prior to what they call grand solar cycle minimums, these periods of weaker sunspot activity. This is called the Dalton minimum. This was called the Maunder minimum. Not every solar cycle minimum is the same, but they create increased weather volatility when we get down to these lower levels. And the reason that happens is this, Ash, and I want to be, it's actually a fairly simple concept. If you have a lack of solar wind because of the rotation of the sun being more erratic around the barycenter, and you have less sunspots producing heat, the amount of energy hitting the atmosphere is going down, which means the atmosphere is cooling. And cold air sinks and it shrinks the atmosphere. So this is an actual chart by scientists that wake up every day and they measure the thickness of the atmosphere. And what this chart is attempting to show that over the last 20 years, the atmosphere of Earth has contracted 4,400 feet from what it was 20 years ago because of the shrinking outer stratosphere, shrinking in that fashion. And this leads us to the number one slide on this deck. And it's this. When you do that, when you shrink the atmosphere, the northern jet stream and the southern jet stream, which are rubber bands around a sphere, crimp. We have been, Ash, in a zonal flow jet stream for the majority of our adult life. Okay? This is normal weather patterns. Yeah, you get a little weather volatility, but nothing too severe. And starting 5 years ago, when we entered this pattern, we are now seeing this kind of an upper airflow pattern, a snake-like meridional, north to south, undulating kind of jet stream. Some viewers might hear weathermen talking about a negative Arctic oscillation or a negative North Atlantic oscillation or a negative Antarctic oscillation, which are measures of amplified jet stream. When you get this, when you see this creates incredible weather volatility. And the reason is when you're in this part of the airflow pattern, it's wet, endless wet, floods, huge storms. When you're in this part of the jet stream, it's high pressure system, record heat, record drought. And because we have this upper undulating airflow pattern, these are stagnant weather patterns. Once they set up, they stay and they won't stop and they won't stop and they won't stop. Whereas in a zonal flow, storms come in and storms come out. Now, when you're here, Ash, in between the two air masses, and you get a clashing of the air masses, is when you get what are called bombogenesis storms. You get your increased tornadic activity, one of the worst seasons we've had this year. You get your 900 inches of snow that they saw in California a couple of years back, setting records. It's that kind of massive airflow collisions that creates incredible storm formations and incredibly unusual weather volatility. Our work going back 1,000 years says that this upper airflow pattern change will not go back to a zonal flow until the sun starts firing up normal sunspots again, which based upon the solar dynamo studies it won't do that until the late 2040s to early 2050s. So what it means is we are stuck in this weather pattern. It doesn't mean every year is bad for every country all the time, but it means almost in every year somebody's going to have some very, very challenging weather, Ash. And that's why the insurance companies are having very big problems in the casualty insurance business, because they've been reserving against actuarial tables that have been going back with the weather that we've seen over the last 100 years, that what we've been seeing in the last 5. I had a CEO of a insurance company who I'm friendly with who said, we've seen 5 1 and 100-year events in the last 5 years that we're not set up to account for. It's really causing a rift in the insurance industry, especially down here in Florida, because we've had some nasty flooding and storms and such. This is the very high profile overall view of what's going on with weather. And one of the reasons why we think agricultural prices are going to see a period of incredible volatility, but also a period of greater chances for upward price adjustments to factor in a more unstable overall climate pattern.
Shawn, let me ask you this, because I'm sure a lot of people watching are having similar questions. I've spoken to my own friends in the insurance industry and heard about obviously the degree of increase in payouts on these policies with extreme weather over the last decade or so. Talk a little bit about this idea of anthropogenic climate change. I know this gets very political very fast, but I'm curious to what extent you see these patterns being representative of climate change, for example, from caused by the burning of fossil fuels versus these cycles that we're talking about, because it seems to me like they're very different types of causal patterns.
Well, most of what I'm talking about here, other than the deforestation that we can talk about at the end in the Amazon, these are natural cycles, meaning there's nothing we can do about it. They're going to happen whether we like it or not. They're driven by the natural order of our solar system and of the planet and how it's structured. Things like deforestation, things like anthropogenic warming from CO2 emissions and fossil fuel, those are the impacts that humans are having, that we think are having on our climate. I go back and I try to look at all kinds of different variables, and we've looked at CO2 emissions. We looked at ice core samples, we looked at tree ring analysis, and we've tried to read hundreds and hundreds of papers on the subject, from physicists to mathematicians to climatologists to astrologists, and we have not been able to find a correlation that weather volatility and that temperatures on Earth have historically been impacted by concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that we haven't found a correlation. So we are staunch about finding objective statistics, cycles, and correlations that meet a minimum of an 85% threshold, meaning that the correlation between two variables is at least 85% or higher, telling us there's some type of a causal event. And we've not been able to find that. You have to remember, we measure weather data on hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years. So while a 50-year period may seem very, very large in time, in climate, it's actually it's a very small data point. I believe in the scientific theory which says that no one has all the information all the time. No one knows all the truth all the time. We always can find new things that we didn't know before that can change how we view what we thought was true or not. The world is flat, now it's round, all those kind of things. So it's possible that there is an impact to CO2 concentrations and what's going on with our temperatures and climate volatility. At this point, we have not come across any compelling evidence that would suggest that it is, but I'm open to changing my mind if that data were to surface. And I always encourage anybody, if they have compelling, and I don't mean 50 years of data, I'm talking about compelling hundreds of years of data that would support a different outcome to the one that we've come up with, I'm glad to reinvestigate our conclusion on that.
Very interesting.
And I think some of the other things we're going to talk about might help just give you some reasons why we think that is the case. Volcanoes, very, very important in terms of increasing or decreasing weather volatility. We know that large volcanic eruptions tend to occur in greater frequency when the sun is quiet, when the sun's magnetic field strength is weak. Not to get too far afield, but the Earth is bombarded by galactic cosmic rays all the time. And when the magnetic field strength of the sun decreases, these highly charged particles bombard our Earth with greater degree of concentration. And what that does is it weakens the magnetic field strength of the Earth. The magnetic field strength of the Earth has fallen 15%, weakened 15% in the last 15 years because of this weakening of the sun and increase in galactic cosmic rays entering the mantle of Earth. When that happens, we get what's called tectonic destabilization, and large earthquakes and large volcanic eruptions tend to occur much more frequently. In fact, they measure these by what's called the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It's like the Richter scale, 1 to 8. We are looking for VEI 6s or higher that can have a dramatic impact to global weather volatility. Over the last 1,000 years, we've had 10 of these VEI 6 or higher volcanic eruptions. All but one have occurred during these periods of quiet sun. Tonga was the first one to go off during this grand solar cycle minimum, right on schedule. It occurred on January 15th, 2022. It actually punctured the mesosphere. Only one of the volcanoes ever been known to puncture the mesosphere. If you actually looked at a picture from outer space, it bulged the atmosphere out into space. It was just incredible how powerful this volcanic eruption was. What made this volcanic eruption unique, Ash, is that every single major volcanic eruption that's occurred in the last 1,000 years have been what's called a sulfur dioxide above ground volcanic eruption. Sulfur dioxide is a global cooling agent, meaning they pump these sulfur dioxide aerosols in the atmosphere. They stay there for 3 to 5 years, and it blocks the sun from coming in, and it lets the heat go out, and it's known to be a massive cooling agent when they occur. Mount Tambora, by the way, was one of these that went off in 1812, and the 2 years that followed that eruption, you can put in your computer the year without a summer. We actually had frost in Iowa the 2 summers afterwards because it got so cold because of the sulfur dioxide concentrations that were pumped into the atmosphere because of that kind of a size volcanic eruption. So these are part of the cycle. This is part of why weather volatility increases. So this one, however, was an underwater volcano. It pumped water vapor aerosols into the stratosphere instead of sulfur dioxide. It literally doubled the concentration of water vapor aerosols into the atmosphere in 6 hours. It has never happened before in 1,000 years, according to our research. It's a 1 in 1,000 year event. All the research from NASA to all the smartest people said, well, we know that the most powerful greenhouse gas known to humans is water vapor. And if you pump water vapor aerosols into the stratosphere in that kind of concentration, we are going to be looking at a spike in global temperatures in the next 3 to 5 years after that eruption went off. That was the prediction that was made by many, many papers that anybody can research and read if they wish, that went over the science as to why they expected a dramatic spike in temperatures from this highly unusual water vapor volcanic eruption. This is actual measurement of water vapor aerosols in the stratosphere. Notice that how massively we increased it during the eruption, but also notice we're starting to see these water vapor aerosols starting to precipitate out. What does that mean? It means the Tonga effect is going to start to weaken, Ash, meaning we think we have 1 more year of the Tonga effect, and then that Tonga effect is going to start to ease back. One great way. Are you able to see these charts? Are you able to see the temperature chart here?
I'm able to see it perfectly.
Okay. So it says Tonga eruption. This is when the Tonga eruption went off. This is satellite temperature of the lower troposphere. And you can see dramatic spike in global temperatures the immediate 2 years after the Tonga eruption went off, exactly as would have been predicted of this type of a water vapor volcanic eruption. And with that, we would have expected to have gotten record high temperatures and record drought potential, and the potential for also record rainfall, because this type of upper airflow pattern increases or actually elongates that meridional structure of the jet stream. So this is, in our view, the majority of the reason why we've seen this big spike in temperatures, and why we've seen record high temperatures in many, many places. We call it the Tonga effect. We're already starting to see some give back here as these water vapor aerosols are precipitating out. And so we think that this is the last water vapor volcanic eruption we're going to see. We believe the ones that we see after this are going to be your typical sulfur dioxide ones. Be on the lookout for these, is what I'm trying to get at, Ash. These are very, very impactful to weather volatility, very impactful to accentuating the extreme volatility patterns that we already have in place. There will be more. On average, we get 3 of these during a grand solar cycle. We've already had 1. We should have at least 2 more. If you see somebody that gets on TV and says, in Indonesia, this volcanic eruption just went off and it is a VEI 6, you need to know that weather is going to go off the rails in a major, major impactful way. And you need to act accordingly, whether in the insurance business, whether as a producer in terms of what you're thinking about in terms of your hedging, cash marketing, or as an end user, livestock producers, your feed needs, locking in, protecting those prices, all those kind of things. A bell should go off the next time you hear somebody suggest that might be happening. Not every volcanic eruption you hear about means anything. It's got to be VEI 6 or higher, which means column height 30 kilometers and material in the stratosphere. You need at least 10 million tons of sulfur dioxide to be deposited in the stratosphere or more to have a global material impact on weather volatility. It has to be a VEI 6. A VEI 5 might have a local effect, but not a global effect. We're interested in the global effects. So the takeaway from this is volcanic eruptions matter, and they tend to be much more active during periods when the sun is quiet.
You want to unfuck your shit? This is live.
Yeah, that's being recorded. Hey, listen, if you want to unfuck your future, then come and join us in the Real Vision community. Incredible platform, amazing content, some of the smartest people in the world, and amazing tools. And guess what? It'll cost you nothing. Come to realvision.com. I'll see you there. And let's help you unfuck your future.
Let me ask this, just looking at this chart of the Tonga eruption, is the implication of this research that you're going to see that begin to roll off, meaning you're going to see this returning closer to that baseline as this particular heating effect from this particular eruption begins to subside?
Well, if you notice, we already are starting to see a small retrenchment. If you can see that, we're already starting to see a little give back here. It's going to be a gradual give back. Those water vapor aerosols are precipitating out gradually. We don't think this is a spike back down, but we would anticipate that we would see this a gradual working down, back to, to more the starting point here. I would give it 2 to 3 years. We've not had one of these in 1,000 years. So understand that we don't have a model to go by here, Ash. We're trying to, figure this out as we go. But based upon what I'm seeing, I would expect this to be a slow bleed back to something more normal where we would have been had we not had this Tonga eruption go off when it did.
Very interesting.
So oceans matter. Sea surface temperatures matter a lot. And so what we have learned is that we know that the sun's activity matters. Its motion around the barycenter matters. We know the moon impacts our oceans. And the Earth wobbles around its axis 5 degrees every 18.6 years. And we know the solar system planets are influencing this entire system. It's called the Earth, Moon, Sun oscillation or nutation cycle. And it has the ability to either create downwelling, meaning an overall downwelling of current. Downwelling means that you're keeping the warm sea surface temperatures onto the surface. Because if you're having downwelling forces, you're keeping the surface temperatures warm. You're keeping the warm top sea surface temperatures on the surface. You're not bringing it from underneath. There's times that we go upwelling. all this cold, crisp air, water that's below, deep in the oceans, when you get upwelling, it brings it to the surface and cools our oceans. These are long cycles that we have a lot of good clarity on. This is simply a chart of the PDO. It's generally a measure of the sea surface temperatures of the Pacific. This is the bottom chart's the measure of the AMO, which is essentially the sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic. And extreme weather volatility occurs when the oceans are warm or they're cold. That's where you get maximum weather volatility. So as an example, in the 1930s, one of the hottest decades the world has seen up until now, you can see that both the oceans were piping hot. And we had the Dust Bowl. We had, just to give an example, Iowa had 36 100-degree days in 1936, 34 100-degree days in 1934. You know what's the maximum number of 100-degree days we've had in a growing season since 1940? 10. We haven't come close to this kind of weather volatility on the hot side. And of course, in the 1970s, we know we had incredible cold temperatures, long winters, early freezes. I was being told when I was 5 years old that we're going into a ice age during this time. That was the talk of the town at the time, that we were going to move into an ice age and that growing food was going to be almost impossible because the oceans were producing such a cold overall weather volatility climate. Where now, we've been on the other side of that equation, but it's a 60-year cycle when we go back from hot to cold. Right now, we're peaking on the hot, and this brings us to a very important cycle, Ash. It's called the 89-year Gleisberg cycle. Every 89 years, as depicted here and here, is when you get maximum downwelling from all these interactions of the sun, the moon, on the earth, and the planetary arrangements. Dr. Gleisberg, who was a famous physicist, figured this out. And that's why the 1930s was so hot and dry and droughts were prevalent, and why we're seeing sea surface temperatures yet again at record high levels, seeing record hot temperatures, seeing droughts elevated. And of course, the Tonga effect just exacerbated this cycle, which we did not have over here. So what this cycle suggests is that we are sitting here at peak global sea surface temperatures, which then produces peak global temperatures, which maximizes peak weather volatility as this cycle comes to an end. That cycle would come to an end, Ash. It started in 2020 and it will end around 2030 before the Gleisberg cycle effect changes and we go back when we start going into what's called an upwelling phase on our oceans. And this next chart's really clear about how this works. This is the heat content. We used Greenland Sea. You could look at any body of water. It pretty much shows the same kind of trends, that from 1900 to 1940, we had a perpetually warming sea surface temperature of our oceans. Temperatures kept rising and rising and rising, reaching a peak during the 1930s. And then which was the Gleisberg cycle right here. And then we went upwelling. All the sea surface temperatures declined for 40 years. Super cold, super volatile in the 1970s, massive weather volatility, price volatility. And then the downwelling forces kicked in again. And we've been seeing these sea surface temperatures rising. And now we're expected to peak as the 89-year Gleisberg cycle reasserts itself with the maximum downwelling forces. I could go back earlier than 1900 and the same pattern holds. Sea surface temperatures determine the temperature above it. If the sea surface temperatures are hot, you're going to have hot weather. If it's cold, you're going to have cold weather. And it also impacts the upper airflow pattern. So these are the sea surface temperature cycles that are currently causing this heightened weather volatility around heat, drought, along with the sun going into a quiet phase, something that was not happening, by the way, Ash, in the 1930s. This was just a sea surface temperature weather volatility cycle. This one is the oceans and the sun combining, creating a higher order weather volatility cycle to the one that we had here. So I want to start bringing this into what are we seeing now? What can we expect now? What's going on now? So I want to take this little out there and let's bring it a little more. What can we expect? Where's the risk points in weather for the next few years in agriculture? This is something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. The lower the number, the more arid the soils are. It's a way of just determining how dry the soils are, typically 3 meters deep. We drew circles at the last 3 Gleisberg, 89-year Gleisberg cycles, showing that the 1 in 100-year drought occurred at each of these important cycles. We went back further, Ash, and using tree ring analysis and ice core samples, we were able to actually verify a reconstructed Palmer Drought Severity Index going back to the year 955 that showed roughly, if you average all of these together, it's an 89-year cycle. There's some variability. There are a few outliers here, that were a little longer than the 89 years, but pretty close to an 89-year cycle. We see this 1 in 100-year drought occur in the Midwest. Using the 89-year cycle, the year 2025 would be your perfect statistical year for this to occur. Now, there was a 91 year, there was a 92 year, so we can give it a little leeway. We could say it could be a little, it could be in this range, but in a perfect statistical scenario, 2025 would be your ideal statistical scenario that you would say your greatest chance for an 89-year Gleisberg 1 in 100-year drought cycle to occur would be this coming growing cycle. Get this question asked to me all the time. How do you know these cycles are going to repeat? The answer is I don't know they're going to repeat. All I can share with you is they have repeated, and believing that history repeats or rhymes, and that weather has historically continued to show cyclicality, we would expect the likelihood of them repeating to be very, very high. Is it 100%? No. Am I guaranteeing it? No. What I'm saying is the potential for a very significant climatic event in the Midwest over the next few years is probably as high as you're going to get. Deep down, because I love U.S. farmers and I have a bias to U.S. and North American farmers and their well-being. I wish this doesn't occur. I don't want this to occur. It would be devastating to them to occur. My job is not to tell them what they want to hear, is to tell them what I think might be the risk point and how they could alter their businesses, do different things with crop insurance, handle things with their farm in a way that can mitigate, not reduce totally, but mitigate some of these risks so that they can get through it and get to the other side. So that is something we have our eyes on, Ash, for the next few years, is looking for signs that we're developing this kind of a cycle here in the United States. So that is one thing that could be impacting our markets as early as next summer, for example. To narrow this down a little bit, Ash, we went back to 1895. And this is the Palmer Drought Severity Index going back to 1895. We looked at all the major droughts that have occurred. The lower the number, the drier the soil. Every single one of them occurred when we either were in a neutral or in a La Nina state. Neutral to La Nina state. We never had a major drought in an El Nino. These are the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Central Pacific. That's how we determine El Nino, La Nina. So we know if you have El Nino, we're not expecting a major drought. So what do the next 2 years look like? Are we fitting into the mode where we might be able to see one of these occur? Meaning, are we looking at El Nino, La Nina? What are we looking at here? And so I want to share some of the work and how we do this. So this black line is the exact sea surface temperature anomaly of the Central Pacific to the present day. You can see we're in roughly a neutral mode. If you take the best correlation coefficients and you going back to 1950 and you match it, it shows that we are likely going to remain in a neutral negative, maybe moderate La Nina going out into next summer. So this says that we were not likely going to have El Nino next summer, which means at least the possibility that the Gleisberg cycle drought could be in play is in play if this analysis is correct, because we won't have an El Nino next summer. In fact, we don't think we're going to have an El Nino the following year. Our work says the next 2 years, we like it to remain in a neutral or neutral La Nina environment. So that's supportive of the potential for a major drought in the United States, because every drought has only occurred if we've had a neutral La Nina state. So that's that. One other thing before we move on, Ash, is this. These are the sea surface temperatures that occurred in the 2 worst years of the Dust Bowl. 34 100-degree days in 1934, 36 100-degree days in 1936. These were the sea surface temperature anomalies that occurred in each of those years. I want to be looking for May sea surface temperatures that show something close to one of these 2 patterns to give me confidence that the same upper airflow pattern that occurred during these 2 incredible drought years might repeat. Notice both of them were neutral phases of ENSO. So the other thing I'm going to be looking at is every major drought in the United States that has ever occurred, you've had a dry spring and a hot May. So, I'm just not going to go blind and just predict it. I'm going to be looking for these signposts. Yes, no, checkbox, yes, checkbox. So we did the same thing with our frost forecast for Brazil. We laid out signposts. If we get this, then we go, and we kept going down that path that we laid out on Real Vision during then, and we kept checking the boxes, and we got the frost. So this is not about saying, I know for sure this is going to happen. This is about saying, this is what we're looking for. This is what we need to see. Here are the check boxes. Each one we check off, we're increasing our confidence about something like this happening. So that's something everyone needs to be watching for the next couple of years to see if this materializes in the United States. The United States remains the number 1 or number 2 exporter of soybeans and corn, number 4 exporter of wheat, number 1 exporter of cotton. We matter a lot to the supply-demand equation of the world. If we get into trouble, prices are going to have to adjust to account for that reality. And that's what makes watching Midwest weather and whether this scenario plays out extremely important.
Shawn, let me pick up on exactly that point where you talk about the supply-demand equation relative to commodities produced in the American Midwest and North America more generally. Talk a little bit about the implications for price and how that analysis that you've done from weather works its way through the system from a supply-demand perspective.
Well, I think it's very important to know your choke points. I call them choke points, probably a better term for it. The U.S. is a choke point, meaning you have trouble with production there. The whole ag food chain gets disrupted. Brazil is another choke point. They're number 1, number 2 in just about every ag market: coffee, sugar, corn, soybeans, cotton. You go down the list. Another choke point. Russia, Ukraine, another choke point, especially for wheat, especially for corn, another choke point. So we have these choke points that we focus on. We can have very, very ugly weather in Australia. Nothing against Australia. I love Australians, great people, great farmers, but it's not going to change the food chain, the plumbing, as we call it, in agriculture to a degree that's going to impact price to a major degree. We need to have weather volatility occur in Brazil, US, Russia, Ukraine. Sometimes Europe can get into the mix because as they're a prolific wheat and corn producer. Obviously, China is very, very important. Although the problem with China is we have a kind of a black box over there. We don't really get good information. We don't really know how to analyze that information. So harder to get a market to react to a black box than countries that have more transparency, like the areas that I just mentioned. So we try to focus only on those choke points and what impacts a good crop or a bad crop could have on the plumbing of the supply demand in agriculture, and what that might mean for prices, and what that might mean for how prices might need to react to balance that out, depending on the extremity of the weather that we're talking about.
And that's just a function of the concentration of where those commodities are produced. Is that right, Shawn?
That is correct. That is correct. It just, Russia has become the number 1 exporter of wheat in the world. Europe is number 2. we're number 4. We're actually not in the top 3 for wheat exporting. We're number 4. It's about concentration. It's just about where the focus and the concentration has been in particular commodities. Coffee, Brazil dominates. Vietnam dominates. Cocoa, West Africa dominates. In wheat, obviously, Russia, Ukraine dominates. In corn, Brazil and the U.S. dominate. In soybeans, the U.S. and Brazil dominate. In cotton, it's the U.S. and Brazil and India that dominate. In rice, it's India and Southeast Asia that dominate. So every market's got their choke points. They're dominating areas that weather can have a greater impact to supply and demand equations. And it's important to know the market you're in. So for example, a few years back, we were very high on the cocoa market on Real Vision and mentioned that we thought there was a choke point there, that weather volatility was going to reach some pretty unsavory levels that we could see a significant readjustment to the upside. And as anyone has been following the cocoa market, it's reached all-time highs here over the last month, over the last year, 2 times higher than it's ever achieved in history. The choke point, the historic weather volatility that in fact was verified in West Africa. These are the things we look for and look for the signposts to tell us it's happening or not happening. And it's very important to know that, know what matters, know what doesn't matter, because I think a lot of people in the ag market space try to make too much of countries that don't matter and don't pay enough to the countries that do matter. And we try to emphasize, don't pay attention to the back crop here. It's not really going to move the dial. But if it happens here, cowbells ring. So
very interesting.
So I want to move to Brazil. I want to talk about something that's happening right now, real time, actionable thing happening right now that is an offshoot of everything we've just discussed. Hopefully, you'll understand the gravity of what could be about to take place. We talked about volcanoes, solar cycles, sea surface temperatures, and deforestation are the 4 variables that throughout history have caused increases in weather volatility. We believe a major human-induced microclimate change has occurred in Brazil that is permanent unless we go about creating reforesting the Amazon. Through expansion of agriculture in Brazil, they have used 20% of the Amazon for agricultural production, mostly livestock, grain production, that sort of thing. And so this very, very white area means there's no Amazon left. It's gone. And this green, beautiful area is saying that the Amazon is alive and well, doing pretty good. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown that what has happened with the 20% reduction in the Amazon is that you've ruptured the natural atmospheric river mechanism that supported the Amazon monsoonal flow that kept the northern half of Brazil in almost a rainforest condition into perpetuity. We've said that we feel that they've killed the golden goose. They've gone too far. Their expansionary plans have taken too far, and they've created themselves or boxed themselves into a permanent microclimate change unless they do something to reverse it. They have been slowing down this reduction in the Amazon deforestation, but they're still deforesting it. One of the ways that we're measuring this, Ash, is the total rainfall from September 15th through June 1st. That's their entire growing season. It's a long growing season. You can see very steady rainfall, steady rainfall, steady rainfall, steady rainfall, and then a collapse of 50% in rainfall in center northeast, center north, center west Brazil. This has never happened before. Going back 150 years, we have not seen anything like this. No one can explain this other than the deforestation of the Amazon to the degree that has been done. We know, looking at the Amazon monsoon, it's just not active anymore. If you look at a satellite picture today of Brazil, there's not a cloud in the sky. It's last year, the Amazon monsoon actually did not fire up for the entire growing season for the first time in history. Something's going on here. Now, I think there's enough evidence, Ash, that we can start connecting the dots that what's going on here is something very, very serious and long-term in nature. And it's something that's having a huge impact on their ability to grow grains and ag products. Many will ask me, well, Shawn, how come they haven't had problems with production up until now or just recently? Well, they produce so much rainfall here, Ash. You could lose some of it and you're still getting enough rainfall. But we're now getting to the point where we're not generating enough rainfall to produce a good crop. One of the ways that we can measure this is something that is put out by the satellites. It's called deep layer subsoil moisture that goes down 3 meters deep. You can see on the bottom chart, these are percentiles. These are percentiles going back to 1948 that all this almost black color here, I should have drawn these a little slow, but you can see you're in the lowest 2 percentile, in many cases where it's black, the lowest subsoil moisture ever seen for this time of the year. Ever, really. That's very problematic because they're about getting ready to plant. The way the growing season works down there, Ash, they start planting soybeans in mid-September, or they would like to start planting soybeans in mid-September. If there's no subsoil moisture, you can't plant crops in dry soil. They won't germinate. They won't come out. They won't, you're not going to get anything going on. So you have to wait for moisture to come. The longer this drought goes on, the more it gets delayed, and it gets delayed. Last year, they were heavily delayed in their planting because of a severe drought. It was nowhere near as severe as this. The way this works, Ash, is if you get to October 15th and soybean acreage plantings are behind, you're going to have a late planted crop. There's no way to overcome that. The way this works is you plant the soybean crop and you plant the corn crop in behind the soybean crop in February. If you plant the soybean crop late, you're going to harvest it late, and you're going to plant the corn crop late, which means you're not going to plant as many acres. And the later you plant the corn crop next year, the more it gets pushed into the dry season, the lower the yields come down. We saw that last year. Corn production last year was down over 15% because of lower acres and lower yields because of a late planted soybean crop. One tentacle leads to another tentacle. Another important crop in this area is sugar, which is grown right here, and coffee. And oranges for the orange juice crop are grown right here. The problem with coffee and orange juice is they are flowering. They're flowering, right? We're entering what's called the flowering season, where the trees flower, produce either fruit or cherries in the case of coffee, and you have to have moisture. You have to have moisture to have a flowering, and then you have to have follow-on rains to then allow that flower to then set, produce the fruit, and produce the cherry. Last year, we had record hot temperatures and a record drought during the month of October. It destroyed the flowering and created a very, very poor crop. And coffee prices have rallied from $1.40 a pound. I don't know exactly where they're trading today, but they've been trading around $2.30 to $2.40 a pound. And we're now entering the next flowering season, and we have a worse subsoil moisture profile by an order of magnitude from what we had last year. If rains do not show up in the month of October, we're going to have another extremely poor orange crop, a very extremely poor coffee crop, and we're going to have another late planted soybean crop and a late planted corn crop. You can see how what's happening here. Everything leads to the other. And this Brazil represents in most of these markets, Ash, the number one or number two exporter of these products in the world. Choke points. Brazil had, if this becomes their 1 in 100 year Gleisberg cycle drought, just putting it out there, if this is their drought that is induced by weather volatility through Tonga and through the deforestation of the Amazon, this is going to be felt across the globe for years with an S, not just a few months, because they are a critical breadbasket to the world. And all I can express to you is that What typically will bring rain into northern Brazil in this area that's so much needed, what typically brings rain is to have a La Nina. Having a solid, strong La Nina is what can, create the ability to get some rainfall into this region.
Shawn, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Is because you broke out a couple of key commodities there, soybeans, orange juice, corn. Talk a little bit about the potential price implications that what we're looking at right now may cause into the future, and what the probability of those price fluctuations might be based on your analysis.
All the variables that we look at, Ash, and we're talking about the period from right now through November, okay? Because right from here through November, we're going to set the planting for soybeans. We're going to set the flowering for coffee. We're going to set the flowering for orange. Like, the deed is going to be done by November. We don't believe we're going to have a major La Nina by then. We think it's going to remain, as we showed in that prior chart, it's going to be mostly neutral, negative, but not a strong La Nina, which means I don't believe we're going to get that to create rain in the northern half of Brazil. The monsoon issue, because of the deforestation of the Amazon, I mean, that's a permanent feature. That's not going to go away. We know that there's something called subsidence. That is to say that where there is dry soil, it perpetuates dry air above it in a cycle until a climatic event comes along so powerful to override that subsidence. So where it's known that where you have dry soil, you're likely to perpetuate a drought for, it's a higher probability cause of perpetuating a drought in those areas where you don't have good subsoil moisture. Other factors that I will throw into the mix, there's something called the Antarctic Oscillation, which is a measure of how amplified the jet stream is in the southern hemisphere. It's been extremely negative. Negative means more amplification. A negative AAO tends to produce ridging, or a high pressure ridge in the center north of Brazil, which would perpetuate drought. Our work says that's going to perpetuate through November. And the last thing that gives us confidence is the tropical South Atlantic, which are the waters just south of West Africa, have gotten super cold. And that super cold sea surface temperature regime tends to produce a teleconnection of a very dry northeast Brazil. So everything says to me that the drought that we're in is likely to at least perpetuate into November, which means the deed will be done for these commodities that are really in harm's way during this time. And I would anticipate that markets would have to start factoring in, they call it adding weather premium in, as we get further along into the system. I believe mid-October, if we're trying to put a kind of a dot on a map, mid-October is really a very important time. If we aren't getting rains by then, coffee flowering isn't going to play out. If we don't get planting in time by October 15th, the planting of soybeans is not going to play out. It's really important that we have to get some meaningful rainfall in here, Ash, by the middle part of October, or else I think the markets would have to react to this because of how important Brazil is to the supply-demand food chain for the world, for these markets that are so important in the production here in Brazil.
Shawn, I'm mindful of time here, and I want to make sure that you have enough time and opportunity to wrap up and contextualize everything we've been talking about here. I've got time for maybe one or two more slides. Talk a little bit about how you think folks who've been watching this conversation can start to apply and think about what they've learned here today.
Well, I think when I mention weather volatility, everybody always thinks only on the up. It's also on the down. Volatility means up and down, right? So the volatility means that you're going to have those years. Let's say this turns out to be what it is, a 1 in 100 year drought result. We're going to have a significant upside volatility event. But when prices get too high, production comes back. They get a good year at some point. No country's going to have a bad year every year. You're going to get the crash. So look at the grain markets. We had that big surge from late 2020 into 2022. Prices went through the roof, and we're now sitting, in most cases, 50% below where we were just 2 years ago. Weather volatility means price volatility means it's not a one-way street. You have to be mindful of the timing of weather, when it's impactful, and how that equates to the demand. Because everyone says, oh, supply. Yeah, but there's also me and you buying it, right? And if it gets too expensive, we're going to pull back on that. And that's a very important part of the equation that seeps into the market, that the market gets surprised with. And so you have to remember, $100 corn is not going to happen, right? It's not, we're not going to go from $4 corn to 100. There's a point where no one is going to need the corn at a certain price level, and you reach plateau. Just understand that while I think overall ag price inflation is generally going to be your trend for the next decade because of weather being more adverse, it doesn't mean it's a one-way street. It doesn't mean it's you just buy and hold and it's straight up. It just means that generally speaking, I think we're going to be in a volatile uptrending type of market.
Shawn, any other points you'd like to add before we conclude here today?
The only other area that I would like to highlight real quick, because it's a now thing, is Russia, Ukraine. We talked about another choke point, especially for winter wheat, choke point. Corn, especially for Ukraine, because they're big corn producers. Europe, especially for winter wheat and corn. The way winter wheat works, just for Ash, is that they plant the winter wheat crop in September and October. It goes into dormancy during the wintertime. It comes out of dormancy in the spring, and then they harvest it in June, July, for the most part. So they're getting ready to plant the winter wheat crop. If it's dry, you can't really plant the winter wheat crop. Or if you try, it's not going to come out, or it's not going to come out in good condition. It's not going to have a good stand. It's going to be more vulnerable susceptible to frost risk. So, for example, we had one of the worst frost events in Russia, Ukraine in May this past year of all time, at a time that the winter wheat crop was in poor condition. One of the reasons why their crop was down 15% year over year. This is another choke point to watch as you move into the September, October, November timeframe, because if they don't get that crop planted or don't get it planted in time, wheat feeds the world and so does rice. It's very important that these two areas, produce big crops, and it's another choke point that is manifesting a lot of these weather volatility cycles that we've been talking about. And so, from a present action standpoint, one of the last slide that I'll leave you with, Ash, and I think it's very important to I did that again, didn't I? I think it's very important to end on this. This is corn, soybeans, and wheat relative to all ag markets and relative to all commodities. I view this as the PE of a stock, the price to sales of a stock, the price to book value. Pick your ratio, Ash. But this is telling you, are grain markets cheap relative to everything else? Because nothing trades by itself. Everything trades relating to everything else in this world. And so when you look at the green box, you can see there's only been a few times that grain markets have been this under. In fact, they're the most undervalued they've ever been at this moment in time relative to all other ag markets. They're the third cheapest they've ever been. This is going back to 1945. This is the third cheapest they've been relative to all commodities. Just because an asset is cheap doesn't mean it has to go higher. You need to have a sufficient catalyst to change the value of that asset relating to everything else. But appreciate that we are in a rare situation of undervaluation. Historically, we've rarely seen before, and historically has led to changes in trend. I feel strongly that what I've shared with you today, with the sun going quiet, the sea surface temperature reaching peak from the Gleisberg cycle, potential for 100-year drought in the U.S., the current 100-year drought going on in Brazil, and the significant drought going on in Russia, Ukraine, that there's sufficient potential catalyst here over the next 6 to 12 months that if any one of these were to generate that catalyst of less supply, these undervaluations would likely have to be altered to something more normal, or even look where we were just a few years back. We were on the high side of valuation. So to me, that's the opportunity that I see, is someone looking at the grain markets, somebody looking at grain ETFs, somebody, a producer wanting to know, should he be cash selling his grain right now? A livestock producer wanting to know, should he be buying his feed right now? I think this is something that I would be looking and saying, I think this is probably a buyer's market, and those that are on the cash buy side that are interested on the buy side, I think that there could be this could be a very interesting window of opportunity for for markets to change trend and potentially change trend fairly violently. And that's where I currently see the most undervalued opportunity. The opportunity in coffee, for example, though, I have to end on that one. Stocks to usage ratio, the tightest ever seen. If that flowering were to fail or not have a good flowering over the next couple of months, and we get into a supply squeeze scenario like we did in the orange juice market, like we did in the cocoa market, there's potential in coffee to do something there to the upside that it's not done before, meaning exceeding its potential highs from the 1970s. Not a guarantee it's going to happen. Obviously, if the rains come and the flowering goes well, the market can have a significant setback, but that's the opportunity I see for those that are looking for a market that has momentum in coffee, and for value buyers or for those looking for value in the grains. Those, depending on where you are in the spectrum, that's where I see the opportunities right now.
Shawn Hackett nicely and crisply summarized there at the end in terms of the actionable intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure when you come on Real Vision.
Always a blast, Ash. Thank you for having me. And hopefully we can do this again real soon.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
It's a brilliant, brilliant event, and you'll come away with lots of new ideas and a better understanding of this incredible exponential world. You get to speak to the smartest people like you trying to figure this out, but also the people on stage. They're the experts. So we get all of that, all in one place, in Singapore. What more can you ask? See you at TOKEN2049.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.